All right, hey guys, this is Jonathan over at American Off-Road Customs. We are doing a bunch of upgrades in this 392, but I wanted to take an opportunity while we got it mostly put together to talk about depth wobble and the front end of these vehicles. And a lot of questions that we come across with this. Why do I have depth wobble? Why is it so hard to diagnose? I don't understand what these parts are and why I need them and why it's important. So I figured this would be a good opportunity to kind of showcase some of that and explain a lot of what's going on here. And this is not just a Jeep specific thing. This is true for pretty much any solid axle vehicle. So, you got your Broncos and stuff that have independent front suspension. It's going to be different. But if you've got an F-250 that's got a solid front axle, this same kind of stuff applies. There might be some slight differences, some of the specifics, but overall, it's the same general concept. So, generally speaking, we're talking about a depth wobble problem. There are two main factors that are usually the culprit when we're looking at these vehicles as far as what causes a wobble. The biggest one is going to be loose parts. So anything in here that is not tight or is moving around when it's not supposed to can cause a wobble. The other issue is anything alignment related. And a lot of times when you've lifted your vehicle and you haven't taken the necessary steps to compensate for that lift, and the alignment is not set the way it needs to be, that puts added stress on some of these components. And it may not wobble right away, but then 6 months later, it's like, why am I wobbling all of a sudden? It's because of the alignment being wrong. It wants to wobble, and now that some of those new parts aren't as tight as they were when they were new, they're moving around and allowing that wobble to happen. So the way you can avoid that is, number one, making sure that all those parts are tight. The biggest one is going to be your track bar up here. So this bar right here going across on the front of the vehicle ties the frame to the axle. This keeps this axle centered on the Jeep. So it allows us to shift it this way or this way in relation to the body. If that moves when it's not supposed to move, then that allows the steering to be affected, and that's where wobble can come from. So making sure this is tight and not moving around cause a wobble. Even if this is tight, sometimes these joints wear out and they're moving around even though they're tight, and that could just mean that the part needs to be replaced. Looking at the stock components compared to aftermarket components, these joints are different design. They're a lot more robust with aftermarket parts that can handle the stress of a bigger tire, the abuse of going off-road, things like that. That's why it's important to upgrade these parts when you're doing that kind of stuff. Also, these bars themselves are physically stronger. They're chromoly steel, they're usually thicker. Stock stuff, while it's not necessarily flimsy, it does flex under added load of bigger tires and doing the off-road stuff. So that's a big thing there. The other thing is the alignment part. So when we lift this vehicle, if you look at the angle of this spring sitting here, so this is hanging down at full droop, right? And as you can see, because of the droop, this pulls the axle backwards. And that's just basic geometry. The link is only so long, it's on a radius, so as this comes down, it moves backwards. Now, the stock control arms, they're at a fixed length. They're designed to operate the suspension on the stock height, the stock spring length. So you put a big spring in here, and now as this comes down, it's going to pull it back further because these arms are longer to accommodate for the added suspension group. If you keep these stock, not only is the axle going to be pulled back further, but the angle of that axle is going to twist. So as this comes down, it's going to twist this way. And that's what we call your caster angle. And that's really the relationship of where this pivot point is. So if you look at where your ball joints are, that's what rotates when you steer, and that's what's changing the angle of the caster when you change your suspension. So by putting adjustable link control arms, or there are other ways to do that. You can do drop brackets and other things. As long as they compensate for that angle change, will keep this caster correct. And what we want to see is we want to see an angle kind of like this, where the bottom is forward, up the top is towards the back, and that creates that natural stability when you're driving down the road. As this gets straighter from being twisted, then you're going to have that more unstable feel, which is really good if you're building a dedicated rock crawler, you're not driving on the street, because it allows it to turn really good. But when you're on the highway, that's not so good. The other side of that is the ball joints themselves. So the factory ball joints, you know, they're pretty strong for the most part, but again, aftermarket tires that are bigger, going off-road, taking that abuse, these things are going to take a lot of stress when you're spinning this thing and you're putting a lot of weight out here that wasn't there from the factory. So upgrading these parts can make the wobble problem less of an issue. Now, these are also really tricky to spot for wear when they're built in, when they're in the vehicle. So they look like this, right? This is what they look like when they're not installed. They get pressed into the knuckles, or the into the C. They get the knuckle slides on here. And so these things, you know, one pivots this way, the other one goes up and down. So they carry the load of the whole vehicle really on these ball joints. And when it's all together, there's so much pressure here, you really can't tell if this thing's moving around when it's not supposed to. So when we're trying to diagnose a wobble problem, we go through and we check all the things that aren't moving, that aren't supposed to move. If that's all good, it's like, okay, well, what's next? We can check for play in the ball joints. We can check for the alignment angles. We can check for play in the hub, which is like where the bearing is that this spins on. All those things are things we look at to see if there's things that move that should not move, or if there's play in areas that there should not be. The last thing that it could be is if these are good, all your links are tight, nothing's moving, your geometry is all good, is tires. We see a lot of times old tires, because tires are expensive, so you try to maximize your life out of them. It could be an issue where they look good, the tread is still got life left in it, but maybe they're 5 years old. Maybe they're starting to show some signs of cracking or aging, things like that. There could also be internal parts of the tire where the bands inside are coming apart. All those things are things that you may not necessarily see, but can cause a wobble in and of themselves. So the best thing to do when you're looking at all this is to kind of start with the most obvious, easy things, kind of work your way down the list. So again, checking for loose parts, reinforcing those parts, making sure your alignment is correct, then working your way down the list from there on the next most likely things that can cause a problem. So let's get into what some of these components are. I know we've talked about ball joints a little bit. Those directly affect, you know, how the wheel rotates, what it pivots on. So right here, this is your tie rod. So this is what links two tires together. So when you are steering the vehicle, you only are adding input on one side through the drag link here. And the drag link connects the knuckle to the steering gear. The tie rod takes that input and transfers it to the other side so that they match movements. And you adjust this one in length to correct for toe. That's one of the things we adjust through your alignment. Now the drag link and the track bar, which is that bar we talked about earlier about how it holds the axle in position under the vehicle, they have a close relationship to each other. It's very important that they have similar angles to each other and they move even with each other throughout the range of motion of the suspension travel. If not, if something's off, alignments aren't lined up, things like that, then when you're driving down the road, you hit a bump and you could want to steer on you. That's what we call bump steer. The other issue is if this thing is a different length or weird geometry when your suspension's traveling, the steering wheel's going to move around even though the wheels aren't necessarily turning. So that's why it's important to make sure that these have the right geometry in relation to each other. You don't really have to worry too much about that. For the most part, that's something that we take care of. We do all this stuff. You don't have to worry about it. We'll let you know if things need to be adjusted or changed. But you don't want to do like a high steer where you flip this without changing something on the track marking and matching it. Stabilizer that's here, that goes, you know, on your tie rod. Sometimes you'll see it attached to the drag link. But for the most part, it's going to look like this or underneath. A lot of people will tell you that this is not a fix for death wobble, or that it is, depending on who you talk to. At the end of the day, this is here designed to absorb the bumps in the road. You're driving down the road, you hit a pothole, you hit a speed bump, you hit one side, you're getting more pressure than the other side. The force of that wants to turn the wheel, right? So you're driving down the road, you hit a bump, and it wants to do this. This is designed to absorb that motion the same way that your shock is designed to absorb that spring pressure. It's going to allow the steering wheel to move, but it's designed to absorb that sudden impact, so it's not so harsh, not so fast. And this will sometimes mask a death wobble problem. And sometimes just putting that on, or a new one on, or a stronger one on, can also make it go away, but it's really not the end-all fix. This is more of a comfort finishing touch, get rid of a little shimmy or something like that to really make it drive smooth. So that's really what this is. And kind of the last thing I want to talk about is your sway bar hooks. So what these do is they tie the body of the vehicle to each side of the axle. So as this side wants to come up while we pull down, it transfers that pressure to the other side so that it wants to do the same thing. So if this side's coming up, it's going to pull on this side, make it one. And that weight difference, so that pressure difference, is going to want to keep the axle flat. Really good for on-road, going around corners and stuff, and keep the body moving. When you're going off-road, that's why Tropicana have that disconnect. It allows this side to move independent of this side. Or if you have a non-Rubicon model, you have manual disconnect, you can take these off. It allows the same thing to happen. More fluid between two pieces. The option for this really doesn't have any effect on the death wobble or steering or anything like that. I do get that question sometimes, but it's not really related. You can take these off, drive down the road, it's not really going to affect the handling other than body. So, not really a wobble concern with these. I get asked at the time this comes off or it's broken, that might be my wobble problem. It really shouldn't affect me. I didn't have any of my Jeep, but it doesn't wobble, so there's also, forgot about the steering under here. So if you look under here, this is, I mentioned the steering gearbox. So this is where the drag link is tied in. So another thing we see with these is you've got a lot of stress and pressure from this bar, from the tires, and your steering input that go right into this pitman arm. The pitman arm is what is attached to the steering gear. Now, this bottom bolt right here, where this is attached, is designed to just rotate. And there's a bushing in here that's designed to keep that thing centered, but it is just a bushing, and it can only take so much stress. So you put bigger tires on there, and you're off-road, and you're trying to, muscle that tire through the rocks with your air down. It's a lot of stress. You're putting a lot of pressure on this thing right here, and this is where you'll end up with that dead spot in your steering. So you're driving down the road, and you go to do small inputs to keep the Jeep straight, and nothing happens. That's because instead of turning this, it's pivoting side to side. And so we added this brace in here to reinforce that, to make sure that that stays solid throughout the range of motion when you're driving all that stuff. So hopefully this explains a little bit more about all the stuff that's on the front of your Jeep or your truck with a solid axle configuration. Hopefully it explains a little bit about some death wobble concerns, what can cause it, and how you go about fixing it, diagnosing it at least. But it's not the end all. So if you have other questions, make sure you hit us up in the comments or give us a call and we'll be happy to help you out.